All right, so welcome to the meeting. We are the Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group for the Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. And we go a couple hours on the economy. And when we meet in person, we would always go and get pizza or food afterwards. But after we do the presentation, we'll hang out here for a while. And any questions you have, you can ask, or you can stop us at any time. You can also put the question into the chat, and we will try to get it answered. So no need to wait till the end of the presentation. We have a bunch of different topics tonight. We're going to go through the coronavirus, talk about what it's doing, some of the key statistics on that, and then also the recent response, the fiscal policy from the government to the checks and the extended unemployment, and we'll kind of go through some of the details of that law that was recently passed there at the end of the year. And then we'll go through Carl will go through the statistical or the regular statistics of the labor market, the economic statistics, and the budget deficit and debt, which are fairly standard that we cover each time. And then I'll come back for a couple of special topics on personal income, which is another way that they measure GDP, or a big chunk of GDP. There's some interesting results from the CARES Act for the last year and how people kept their incomes whole, or how the government helped people keep their incomes whole. And then also one of the big Biden plans coming up is about student loans and whether we can forgive those and how we might do that, and what and how progressive a policy that would actually be, because college folks tend to be actually earning more money than people that did. So we've got some interesting debate topics as we get into that, and some interesting articles. You'll always see the item referenced at the bottom of each page, usually the source for that, unless you see a giant thing that says FRED, in which case that is the Federal Reserve Economic Database. Carl and I do know guys named Fred, and they are good at economics, but that isn't what that means. It is not from Fred. It is from that Federal Reserve Group. And then we'll share some links for you guys on some of the things you can share on Twitter that cover some of the topics that are in this. So probably next month we'll do sort of a year in review, but I think that a lot of the things that we cover normally really do get that. You really get the year in review sort of as you go through this today, just by the nature of how this presentation is constructed and how the typical presentation is. You kind of see how the year's going. We don't just look at the latest month. We look at sort of the year-to-date statistics and how things relate to where they were at a peak or otherwise. So let's get into it. Let me move some stuff out of the way. All right. So, over 4,000 dead just today is my understanding. And this is as of a couple days ago. But you can see almost all the measures. The virus is out of control right now and spiking upward on almost every measure that you could have, whether it's tests, cases, hospitalized, and daily deaths. It's just our, Carl and I will talk about this when we get into the economic stimulus and the relief package. But, we still let people fly, for example. I mean, it's debatable whether we really take this thing that seriously. And that's going to be a big challenge for Biden, is not only to deal with all the distraction of the impeachment and the media wanting to cover that, but then also trying to get back to basics of trying to convince people that we need to do something different than we're doing, or we're going to be wiping out an enormous number of people this year. This is a comparison, shows cumulative cases per million people. And it compares, so it's per capita, essentially. It normalizes for the population. And it covers the United States and then selected other major countries, or in the case of the European Union, a grouping of countries of not exactly the same size, but a little bit bigger population, roughly the same size economy as the United States. And you can see we're in a league all by ourselves. And you've got some of the hardest hit countries are kind of all together there as a group with the European Union. And then countries that are doing relatively better, like Germany and Canada, are down below. But this is cases per million people. For the U.S., that's 60,000 out of a million, so that's 6%. All right. Deaths per million people. We're not the champion. Italy is the champion on a deaths per million people or per capita. But it's about 1,200 per million people. So you've got I'll go through some of the death tolls in regular numbers so you kind of see the total numbers in a second. But we are right near the top of the bad. They're there with the UK and Italy's a bit above us, and the European Union overall is doing better. And again, Canada and Germany doing better. This is a comparison of, this kind of shows deaths and cases per capita by U.S. state. So each state is a dot, and there are a couple of U.S. territories in here. I haven't tried to label everything. I've just labeled some of the ones that I thought might be of interest or some of the outliers. So as you go to the right, that's worse in terms of number of cases. And then as you go up, that's worse in terms of number of deaths, again, per size of population. New York City is off the chart. I don't have it on here because it would have pushed everything else, would have squeezed everything else down toward the origin points. But New York is at 5466 cases per 100K population, so it's sort of north of New Jersey there. And then about 301, though, in terms of deaths per 100 population. And then you can see Illinois there, kind of up, not quite in the center, a little bit off of the center here. Can you guys see the pointer when I use my mouse? Does it show up?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So here's Illinois, and here are the Dakotas. New Jersey up here, New York off the top. A lot of these guys like Florida and Texas are right there at the U.S. average. Surprising, considering. And then California is down here, about the same in terms of the number of cases, but a little bit better in terms of deaths. Arkansas and Utah down here at the bottom. So you get a sense of kind of how the different states are doing. You could probably also see, as you would expect, that the deaths per 100,000 are going up as the cases go up. You know, you could sort of draw a fit line kind of through the center of all of this. The fit that works best is what's called an exponential fit, which actually curls up a little bit toward the top. So it kind of looks like a shallow U coming down through all of this. But if you think about drawing a line through that from the sort of from 0, 0 through the U.S. average, everything above that's doing worse in terms of deaths. And then everything below that's doing a little bit better. In terms of actual cumulative deaths, this was when the number was in the 360 range, we're getting close to World War II total deaths for the U.S. population. So we'll be passing the World War II number, I would assume, late this month or in February for sure, passing that 400,000 threshold with this. And, you know, depending on what happens, anybody's guess. We could go to 1 million. We could get this vaccine out there a little sooner, cut it off a little earlier. But, you know, we'll see how fast we get that virus, that vaccine out. And this is how we're doing on vaccinations as of the other day. 2 days ago. The United States has looks like about 3% of the population, if I'm understanding this right. If we've got 2.72 out of 100 people vaccinated, that would mean almost 3% of the population vaccinated. And the statistics started counting around December 14th. So we're about a month in, and we've got 3% of the population done. So clearly that's going to ramp up. We'll see what that curve looks like when we look at this again next month. But, you know, if you're not using this as a source, it's really helpful. The Our World in Data has a really easy to navigate site. You just click on a few check marks in different kinds of presentations. I believe they also do a daily sort of summary presentation, but this is now prominently featured on their first page, and we'll be able to track how the U.S. is doing. Israel, as you can see, is doing the best of the different countries. And I don't have I don't have details on exactly why Israel's doing a lot better. Does anyone know? Has anybody heard why Israel has done so well? Any best practice they're doing?
My guess is they did a good job of reserving a large quantity of the vaccines for one of the companies that got approved early.
Yeah.
And given the comparatively small population to ours, you know, it gives them the ability to vaccinate, you know, that 20% of their population so far.
They're not giving any to the Palestinians. I heard that.
Yeah.
I did hear that they have.
Yeah.
They haven't given any yet. Hopefully, they'll get in the line somewhere.
All right, but yeah, we'll look at. Well, there's going to be a lot more coverage of this in the next few weeks as we get past the. Well, hopefully, as we get past the inauguration and get going on getting back to issues as opposed to following Trump's every move. Different views here from experts on what percent of the population has to be vaccinated. Initially, you saw a lot of these guys. There's just consensus around 60 to 75% of the population. But Dr. Fauci has said as high as 90% of the population. If we get a much more contagious variant of this that starts spreading around, then you need to move that number up, toward 100, more toward 90 than toward 70. So there's some statistics in here, some thoughts from each of these different groups on kind of their assumptions built into that you can look at. But there's a very good presentation. It's at the bottom here from KPMG, which is a large accounting firm. They're one of the big four firms that audits a lot of the Fortune 500 companies, and they also have a consulting wing. And their economist Constance Hunter did a presentation about a month ago, and really good. So if you get a chance to look through that, take a look. So kind of sort of a quick scorecard of the suffering that's going on in the country. It's very much, we'll have a slide later on sort of the K-shaped recovery that kind of splits the economy into kind of the people that are doing well, the high income people that can work from home, and then the people that aren't doing so well. There was a statistic today that came through from one of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors folks that said that if you're in the lower part of the income spectrum, I think it was at the bottom 20, it's almost 20% of the lower income people near the bottom are unemployed. So it's a much higher rate of unemployment as you work your way down the income spectrum. And it was an estimate from her. That's not a standard statistic that's out there. I've got to hunt around for it a little more, but 20 million are getting some kind of unemployment assistance. There was just this extension of 300 additional, which is going to help, but it's nowhere near the amount that really is needed. You've got 37 million facing food insecurity, including a lot of children. Food bank activity is practically double along the lines of what it normally is, along with the food stamps or what's called the SNAP program. Costs there are almost double, about 72% up. Renters are falling behind. About 12 million households, 6,000 behind on rent. This data, by the way, the data on that is about a month old. And then the poverty rate in 2020 had fallen for a while in June, and then it's jumped up again. Fell because of the CARES Act, the $2 trillion act that was passed back in March, and then hasn't people suffered until recently when this
we have
latest act.
I was going to say we have the extra 600 a week for the unemployed through the end of July,
right,
and then 0 through the end of the year. So
right,
5 months of no extra supplemental unemployment insurance benefits.
That's
and
right.
that's why it went down and then back up.
Yep, thank you. This shows, and this is an older slide, it covers the February to May period, but it gets the point across, which is that it wasn't the shutdowns that hurt the economy. The economy was already beginning to suffer before the shutdowns. Republicans sometimes try to oversimplify that and say that it's the government that's shutting down and forcing, people there are a large number of smart people out there. There are a large number of people that aren't so smart. But there's a large number of smart people that are avoiding leisure activities because they're afraid of getting this thing. And this is even Georgia. This isn't from like a blue state. This is well, actually, I guess we are a blue state now, but it wasn't historically a blue state. Now it's a purple state, but we're blue, I guess. But these numbers had fallen off significantly before, and that's been the case. The economists and epidemiologists, the scientists that study diseases, have been on the same page from the beginning that you fix the economy by fixing the public health crisis. And they're still saying that. That hasn't changed. Just you sometimes get a false set of claims in there that, everything was fine until the government shut it down. And if the government shuts it down, everything's going to crash again, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the economy's already way down. Here's another example. This is the TSA daily travel checkpoint volumes. This is what's going through the airports. And this is the second half of the year. So this is the day of the year. So day 163 through day 353. Air travel, if you use the TSA checkpoint as a proxy for that, it's still half the level, 45% or below. 20% back toward June, 40% around the holidays. We had 1 million people a day flying in the holidays versus about 2.3 million last year. And it just, again, I always say this, I'm just amazed that we allow passenger air travel. If you don't get sick on the plane, where are you staying? You staying in a hotel? Are you staying with relatives? I mean, it just spreads the disease around when we allow people to fly. It's one of those things that makes me wonder how seriously we take this.
Well,
so that's
David,
go ahead.
Lori had a question. Oh,
yeah, there's a question in the chat about why was the economy doing poorly before the shutdown. I mean, the first shutdown that I remember was San Francisco on March 17th. And we had both the February and actually the March employment report was done before that first shutdown. It was the week of the 12th. So it was the week ending March 14th. And we lost 1.3 million jobs in March. And the reason is that once people heard there was a virus, we said, good grief. I was going to use a swear word there. Oh darn. And said, what is safe? I'm not going to go hop on airplanes. I'm not going to go, hang out and risky behavior. At least a large number of us have affected our behavior that way before there were shutdowns. And like the slide David was showing about air travel, there really aren't restrictions on people getting on planes these days. And yet we're not even to 50% of last year's air travel. People have changed their behavior to do what they perceive to be safer than doing what we were doing, a year ago. I know that I personally had planned, multiple trips throughout the year that I never took. And, I'm planning to go to Arizona next month, and I'm probably going to drive as opposed to fly. And to answer David's question about hotels, your fancy hotels have nice fancy HVAC systems with share air among all the rooms. Your cheap motels have through-the-wall HVAC systems that are unique to that room. And your door opens to the outside. And so you're much more isolated, in a cheap motel than you are in a fancy hotel. And at least the cheap motels I was reserving, clean the room and then have it sit for a day before they let anybody else check in. So people are taking steps to make things safe as best they can. But I mean, it was basically people changing their behavior, not any government orders, not anything like that.
Thank you, Carl. So let's go through the response now, what the government's done. Most will focus on what they did lately, but we'll reference back a little bit to the CARES Act. Carl and I put this slide together months ago to kind of talk about what's an ideal response plan look like. So most of the black colored text here is sort of our view of what is ideal. To summarize it, it's you shut down, but you have a large enough relief package to keep people in that leisure sector whole. If the government forces your business to shut down, the government should take steps to make sure that you don't serve. You didn't do anything wrong. If you're a bar or restaurant, it's not your fault. You shouldn't be punished by this. And so different countries have tried different models to do this. We are using our unemployment system to a great extent. We're also using, though, in some cases, loans for smaller businesses to where they get loans that are forgiven if they keep their employees on their payroll. And there was mixed success with that. But you see on the left some different ideas: the unemployment insurance, food stamps, Medicaid, making Medicaid easier to get for people that lose their jobs if their employer doesn't provide it or they're not able to afford COBRA, which is very expensive because employers tend to cover about 2/3 of your premiums. You pay a third, they cover 2/3. So the $2 trillion CARES Act back in March did a lot of this, and as Carl mentioned, the unemployment benefits were $600. A lot of people actually had a higher pay because of those unemployment benefit extensions. And then they expired, though, July 31st. And so for 6 months, people that were affected were scraping by. 20 million people that were getting some type of unemployment insurance. And Also, though, another issue is the idea of targeting, that you want to give the money to the people that need it the most. So clearly someone that goes through all the hoops of applying for their unemployment insurance, someone that's going to be needing this, somebody that's still got a job and is getting a check, do they really need it? Especially if you set the limits very high, where somebody that's making 150 or 200,000 a year is still getting a check, or family where they're making that much money is still getting a check. So you can definitely make an argument that let's target it better. Let's focus on the unemployment insurance, the aid to the small business, de-emphasize the mailing of checks. And we'll go into that in some more detail a little bit later, because there's a good argument that checks are actually not progressive, that you're actually helping richer families more. And we'll show you that, some of the data on that. But, that said, those of us that have thought about MMT, the modern monetary theory, there isn't really a constraint. It's not like the government only has X dollars to spend. The government can spend as much as legislation directs it to spend. And until you get inflation that's so dire that it can't anymore, and we're nowhere near that. There's almost no inflation. And so the government has a lot of room to spend. And why have the suffering? If people have extra money to spend, great, because when finally the virus is behind us, and that day will come, maybe a year or two out, but that day is going to come, they will have a ton of money saved up to spend. And that will make sure that it's sort of an insurance policy to make sure that recovery is robust. So I don't have any problems with checks. It's just they are not the best targeted thing, and you can argue that they are not progressive as much, certainly, as unemployment insurance. So let's look at the new law that was just passed. And I want to make one comment on the last line.
I want to make one comment on the last line of that chart. The fact that we haven't targeted money to state and local governments means that there are still millions of people waiting for unemployment benefits because states are not processing their claims. And so that's a fallout from our failure to give enough money to state and local governments so they can process the unemployment claims, because the federal government was providing the money to pay them. That was it.
Yeah, a lot of different. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, a lot of states have very antiquated systems, and they create a lot of bureaucratic hurdles on purpose to save money. I think the Florida government was on record, if I remember right, back 6 months ago, as deliberately making it difficult to get unemployment in that state, because the Republican view of, if you don't give them any money, they'll find a job, which is silly. It's totally counterfactual. There simply were no jobs. You couldn't just find one because you wanted one bad enough. That's
and your next slide conservative makes that point great, actually.
Yeah. So yeah, this one you can see that. We'll show you some of the unemployment statistics too, but here you see that the jobs really jumped in May and June right after the CARES Act, and then the recovery petered out. You had a big drop off all the way to now. We lost 140,000 jobs in December. And you would expect a bounce in that May-June timeframe, because we had a huge loss of jobs in a little bit March, but a huge loss. And I think it was April, right, Carl, was the big drop, the 20 million? Or was it March?
Yes.
It was April.
March was 1.4 million, April over 20 million.
Okay. And then you had some of a bounce back, but still now it has since faded out. And we're still, as we'll talk about in a bit, still down about 10 million jobs from the February level. And so that's deeper than the Great Recession. So we've got a long way to go to get back.
Republican theory was that when we cut off that extra $600 per week in unemployment benefits at the end of July, was that we would have much more robust job growth after that, because people would need to go out and to get jobs. And as you can see, the Republican theory failed badly.
Yep.
Again.
So these next couple of slides are about what's called the COVID Response and Relief Act, which is the one that was passed right at the end of the year. And this is a summary. So in large groups, you've got unemployment benefits, economic. So the unemployment benefits, it's the extension of unemployment and the addition of $300. The economic impact payments are the checks. The Paycheck Protection Program are the small business loans. The state and local aid, there was some. in education and transit funding, not the kind of blanket aid that we wanted on the Democratic side, but some, and then another bucket. And there's some estimates here of what the multiplier is, meaning what's your payback for every dollar of deficit that we incur. In this case, they're usually more like 100, but what amount of GDP are we getting per dollar of deficit? So this law spent about $920 billion, will add $920 billion to the deficit in fiscal year 2021. What are the multipliers, the ranges? And they range from 0.55, my cursor, right mouse out here, 0.55 all the way to 0.78. And I put a little calculation over here on the right-hand side. A multiplier of 1 is very good. Once you start falling down toward 50% or lower, that's not that great a multiplier. So you get a lot of what's called bang for the buck from unemployment benefits, even a surprisingly good one from the economic impact payments. I wouldn't have thought it was that high, considering the criticism that I summarized for you earlier. And then the others are the paycheck protection programs a little lower. The state and local aid, though, very high. And then the other is just a mismatch, so it's not easy to explain what that is. So the definition of multipliers down there on the lower left. This is a pretty extensive article from the CRFB. They are it's a Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They are a reasonably centrist think tank that goes through this. They are concerned with budgets being out of control, and they tend to report on some of these things a bit ahead of the CBO sometimes. I have not seen a CBO study on this law yet. It may have come out in the last couple of days. I looked about a week ago. I didn't see it. Here's more details. I won't go through all this, but you can see the exact amounts that are in there. And then over on the right-hand side are some of the details about those small business loans. So, it's for businesses with less than 300 employees. They suffered a 25% or greater decline in revenue, and they used the first draw, meaning the first tranche of money that was made available back in the CARES Act. This is the second draw, they call it. The terms are a 1% interest rate, 2 to 5 year maturity. There's something in there about being able to delay when you start paying it back. I don't recall the details. And then if you spend 60% of the proceeds of the loan on your payroll and you maintain your employee and compensation levels overall, you can actually get that loan forgiven. And there is a lot there that people can use. Again, and I don't remember all the details. Maybe Carl or others on the call can help here. The reasons why the uptake wasn't as good as it should have been, because it seems to me like this is a really good deal. Like if you keep your employees on payroll, the government is essentially giving you a loan to make you whole. And I didn't hear that any argument that there wasn't enough money. A lot of the money, my understanding, was left on the sidelines. Any comments on that?
Well, on the first round, I think that there was most of the money got used because a lot of businesses went to apply for these loans and all the money had been committed already. The other thing is that for smaller businesses, the rules of applying were new and complex, and so it took them a while to get their applications in. They were behind a bunch of larger companies that grabbed all the money ahead of them because they had the armies of lawyers and folks who could figure out how to, get the application to the banks.
Both of those certainly match the reporting that I remember. There was also a lot of smaller businesses don't actually keep good documentation, so there was definitely a documentation quality issue with getting some of the loans issued.
Yeah. On a personal family basis, my niece bought became a partner in a yarn store in Columbus in the fall of 2019, and they didn't have records. I mean, although the business had operated continuously, they didn't have continued long enough records under their ownership to apply for a PPP loan and get awarded one. My nephew, who's executive director of a summer camp, a camp out in the Cleveland area, he did get a PPP loan. I don't know what value he got. Of course, his dad's a retired accountant, so Dad may have helped him with the paperwork.
So one of the conference calls that I was on when they were talking about this with other consultants, I do consulting, was that people were talking about how the big firms had the bankers, the banks had account reps who were assigned to the larger companies, and they would explicitly go and make contact with them about helping them through the process of filling out the PPP. Whereas smaller businesses had to go and knock on the doors and shake it down themselves.
That sounds about right too.
Okay. All right. So it did better than I thought in terms of uptake. I thought they had left a lot of money on the side and it sounded like it just didn't get where it needed to go. Okay. All right. Another page, just more of the same. The details. They did extend the eviction moratorium through January 31st, but it's going to take, I suspect it's going to be a priority to extend that again. There's a lot of backlog here. And there also, though, while we pity the renters, we also have to look at the landlords. Not every landlord is a lot of landlords are people that bought a building and rent out one of the floors or rent out one. They're not necessarily super rich people, and the landlords are suffering. And to the extent that a lot of these unemployment payments were pretty generous through the end of July. I'm surprised that we had as big a delinquency problem as we had, considering how generous the CARES Act was, at least through the end of July. But at least since then, through the end of the year, we've gotten into this case of 12 million families. So I've seen numbers as high as 30-something million, 40 million that are at risk of some kind of eviction, and we'll see how that plays out. But obviously, throwing people back out on the streets in the middle of a coronavirus outbreak or middle of a pandemic is not good for everyone.
Or even the middle of winter. I mean, one of the problems that a lot of people had was that, I remember reading the articles last spring of, hey, you're going to get these checks, you're getting this extra money in unemployment, but, hey, evictions are suspended, so let's have a rent strike. Don't bother to pay rent. Keep the money yourself. I think a lot of people got themselves into trouble that way as well. They spent it on other things. And then, of course, when the extra $600 a week ran out, and so in many states, you're dealing with $250 to $450 a week in state unemployment benefits for these people to survive on. There was no way they could pay their bills at that point and keep up.
Right. Okay. All right. So now a little bit of discussion about the nature of, are these 2,000 checks really a progressive? How progressive is it? So the CRFB did a study of this too, and said if you give $600 per person, which is what the law that just passed did, and if you add another $1,400 on top of that, kind of how much goes to different income percentiles. And the reason they explain that this thing looks the way it does is that these larger income percentiles tend to have larger family sizes, sometimes with 2 incomes in them. And so as you get a larger family, you're going to be getting more dollars in checks. And so they're showing how that worked. And so it was to them, my take on what the CRFB wrote was that it had to do mostly with the size of the family. And that because of that, you're seeing this kind of a distribution. Progressive policy, we like to see sort of downward sloping from the left to the right. You want the highest bar over on the left, and then the bar is lower as you go to the right. This one is kind of skewed a little bit to the center, where that 60th to 90th percentile is really the people that are getting the most out of checks. And so you're seeing some pushback from some progressives saying, this isn't necessarily the best choice. This isn't what we would consider to be a progressive type policy. The 0 to 20s and the 20 to 40 should be getting a lot more. The 60 to 90th percentile, those 2 buckets would get less. I'll mention it later, but there's a really good article in the Washington Post that I'll highlight it when we get there that talks about this in more detail. What I just showed you is income. This is net worth. And it shows net worth for different groups. So boxed over here on the left are if you are based on your income, how sizable is the median net worth? And remember, median is half the people are above and half the people are below. So if as Carl likes to say, if Bill Gates walks in the room, it doesn't really affect your median income, but it's going to really affect your average income. And that's why you see those average numbers are a lot higher typically than the median, because there are a few families in each bucket that have a lot more money than other families in that bucket. But point I'm getting at is if you give somebody, like I showed on the prior slide, if you look, let's use 5,000 as a round number. If you give $5,000 to these different percentile groups, it makes a very significant impact on their net worth. And over on the right-hand side, you can see those, I just did the math, assuming a $5,000 check to those families in different buckets, what would that mean? And you can see the percentage increase in their net worth. So over here, for example, families with no high school diploma for either parent, 24% increase in their net worth. So it's 5,000 on this 20.5. Actually, I brought over the 20.5. So this box number here is over here. And then I just showed the 5,000% increase from that. So no high school diploma is 7%. If you are a minority, Black or Hispanic, you're looking at almost a 20% increase in net worth. So very sizable for minority families that have never built their net worth the way that the white families have. And then over here, lower income folks also get a big boost in their net worth. They have almost no net worth, or in fact are debtors. And so if you give $5,000 to those families, it makes a really large impact. So I think the way I think about it is it's a little more progressive when you think about it in terms of net worth than when you think about it in terms of income. Be aware of that side of the argument as you fight with your friends about how progressive this is or isn't. You've got an income argument, you have a net worth argument.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Let me hand off to Carl then.
And hopefully you guys can see a line chart.
Yep.
Okay. Good. I'm glad when technology works occasionally for me. So what we've got here is total payroll employment, which includes everybody who's a W-2 worker. It excludes 1099 workers like your Lyft and Uber drivers, and your people, household cleaning ladies getting hired by individuals. What you see is that we had a big drop in jobs in the Great Recession, and from peak to trough, we were down 8.7 million jobs. We continued to have good job growth up through February. Middle of February is actually when the February number's from. And then in March, we lost 1.3 million jobs. In April, we lost over 20 million jobs. And so peak to trough was 22 million jobs lost. We've been gaining jobs since then, and David showed a nice chart showing that we gained a pretty good number of jobs starting in May, a lot of jobs in June, decent gains in July and August, and we're back under 1 million jobs a month in September, October, November. Negative job gains, so job losses in December, and we're still down about 9.8 million jobs versus the February peak, and we're down about 3 million jobs versus when Trump took office, 145.6 versus 142.6. So we are still down a lot, which is why when the Republicans were saying, oh, we don't need any extra assistance to the folks that are unemployed, it's like there are a lot of people that are hurting right now without supplemental unemployment insurance benefits. Let me open up the chat so I don't miss something here. And this just shows overall employment went down almost 15% for overall for the U.S. And we're back to, I think these are, about a 6 to 7% drop. More for blacks, Latinos, Asians, and whites, all close to the same recovery, although Latinos and Asians certainly went down more than whites. I'm not sure about this because I look at if on average we got to 14%, why did every group go lower than that? How could the average? But I'll worry about those details later. And you see the different groups, and I won't go into them to great extent. The women went down more, but at this point, we're looking at women's and men's employment being down about the same percentage versus pre-recession. And youth are down more and went down a whole lot more and are down more than the older age groups. The prime working age folks are doing the best. This one says that pre-pandemic level employment, our February employment, we're forecasting to reach in the second quarter of 2022. So even though we're going to have and have had vaccines start last month, we've got about 10 million people vaccinated as of a day or two ago. 75% or 70 or 75% coverage on vaccines is 250 million vaccines. And, you know, if we need more than that, by the time everyone gets vaccinated, we're probably looking at the end of the year. And so I think this is probably fairly accurate. GDP may recover quicker than this. GDP typically recovers much quicker than jobs. But if we remember on jobs, in the Great Recession, although we started losing jobs end of 2007, beginning of 2008, we hit our bottom in February of 2010. It wasn't until 2014, May of 2014, that we got to more jobs than we had, prior to the start of the downturn. And we started setting new jobs records. So that's kind of what they're saying here, is that it's going to take a while, not as long as it did in the Great Recession, but it's going to take a while, even with the vaccines. And in the near term, as the Chicago Department of Public Health person said, the best preventative from further spread of the disease is masks, social distancing, avoiding large gatherings, just being smart. Unemployment rates, U3 is the rate that we talk about most often. It had come down to 4.7% when President Trump took office. It went way up to about 14% in April, and then has come down. And to a great extent, the unemployment rate of 6.7% understates the problem to a great extent, because if you remember on the prior, we're down more jobs now versus pre-recession peak than we ever got any time since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're down 9.8 million jobs. At the worst of the Great Recession, we were down 8.7 million jobs. So we're still down a ton. I think the unemployment rate gives people a false sense of security that things are looking okay. They're not. The U6 unemployment rate is the one that includes people that are out of work and have looked for work in the last year. And it also includes people who are working part-time that want full-time employment. Well, that last group is not a huge part of the equation anymore. It's up higher than it was in February, but it's not up a lot. As David said, the people claiming unemployment benefits in the middle of December was still almost 20 million people. And, what we have is 700,000 to 800,000 people filing new unemployment claims every week now. And so I don't see this number, dropping anytime quickly, and it may go up. But the fact that we have this, quote, loss of jobs, and actually not only a seasonally adjusted loss of jobs, but an actual loss of jobs in December. During the Great Recession, people made a bunch of noise about the employment to population ratio was below where it was prior to the start of the recession, and it was continuing to fall. And the overall employment to population ratio for the population as a whole, 18 and over, 16 and over, has been falling since the 1940s. But this prime age group, this 25 to 54 group, had been fairly steady, except with the recession. And we're making some progress, but we still have a ways to go to get back to where we were prior to the recession. And this is showing the drop in jobs as a percentage drop in jobs, because obviously this time we're doing it on a higher base, but we're still, where we are now is a bigger drop in jobs than any other recession. I'll go back to that. Well, I can't go back. Okay. This is saying that the GDP recovery, the jobs aren't going to recover to the second quarter of next year. GDP is expected to recover by the third quarter of this year. So again, Great Recession, GDP had fully recovered, I think, by 2011. Jobs didn't recover until 2014. Inflation continues, as David mentioned earlier, continues to be well under control. Overall inflation, 1.4%. If we exclude the more volatile food and energy prices, inflation is still 1.6%. The Fed's target is we want to have about 2% inflation. And so the thinking is we'll probably go ahead and run even a little bit above 2% inflation for a while as we start to come out and people start to come back to work more, as more things are safer, whether it's because people who are getting vaccinated feel that they're comfortable going back into riskier situations, or when the weather gets warmer and I've got more opportunity to eat outside because I don't like to eat inside even when the governor says I can't. So I have one restaurant in Chicago that I go to now. And if we look at the components of inflation, what we see is that food prices are up over the past 12 months. Energy prices are down. Apparel is down. And medical services are up. So again, this is where we said the all-item inflation rate's at 1.4%. Excluding food and energy, it's at 1.6%. And this just, the notes say that this tells us that we're expecting inflation to be about 2% over the next decade, which again is what the target is. So we'll see if we actually hold to that target. Purchasing Managers Composite Index. Shows that it's growing as of now. But obviously, if we look earlier in the year, it shrunk. I happened to look earlier today. We're down about 500,000 manufacturing jobs versus February. So although it looks like most of the graphs since February is above the 50 line, that's somewhat misleading if you're looking at manufacturing employment, because we're still down substantially. Stock market returns. David, if you want to talk about this one.
Sure. This has a couple of different time periods on it. The blue bar is the one that I think is the most useful for today's discussion, which is really just what happened in 2020. It goes till the 4th of January of this year, but it gives you a sense of it. But there was a 16% return during 2020 for the S&P 500 index, which is a great year. I would be thrilled to take that forever. But the historical is more like 8 or 9%. I think under Democrats, it's 11, and under Republicans, it's 7. So I'm sort of cutting the difference there in the middle, somewhere in the 8-9 range. But you can see the different sectors that did well or not well. Clearly, technology, this is a big year for tech, 39%, that blue line, or 40% up, whereas other areas that are more conservative, like utilities, for example, or energy stocks, were down quite a bit. So it just gives you a sense of which sectors did well and responded well to the coronavirus and which ones did not. And one of the reasons why utilities are, oh, go ahead, Carl.
I was going to say, of course, tonight's meeting is an example of that. We're using this technology and bought this technology we didn't have a year ago, and none of us are drove to the meeting, so we didn't buy any gas.
Right, that's a good way to put it. I mean, and utilities also are wrestling with the, you think of it as businesses are not, people are not going into the offices to work, and so they're able to save, the buildings are not using the kind of energy the way that they would if they were occupied fully. And so there was a drop-off in the utility revenue. I don't know to what extent they've been able to use, to talk to their regulators to address that. But, a lot of people that are retired rely on utility dividends to help them. And my understanding is utilities haven't done a lot of dividend cutting yet. A couple of big ones did, but most of them have maintained it. But we'll see how that progresses, because if they're not getting a lot of revenue from the commercial spaces, it could change their business around a little bit. So.
Okay. Next slide. Here's the budget deficit. And here, again, we're looking at the budget deficit. The blue is the January 2017 forecast the CBO did, basically as President Trump was taking office, saying, if we have no new policies, this is what we expect the budget deficit to do. Fiscal year 2017, which was basically 4 months in when President Trump took office, we thought would be at $559 billion deficit, shrinking to 487, 601 in fiscal year 2019, 684 in fiscal year 2020, and 797 billion in fiscal year 2021. And instead what we've had was the budget deficit went a little higher. In fiscal year 2017 was about 300 billion higher in 2018. Was about 383 billion higher in 2019. So this was all pre-coronavirus. It was forecast to be over $1 trillion this year before the coronavirus hit. And obviously with the coronavirus and the CARES Act and the loss of tax revenue, the deficit exploded to 3.1 trillion. Looking at fiscal year 2021, just including this most recent legislation, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget is forecasting a $2.3 trillion deficit, again, versus that $797 billion forecast from back in 2017. But what's not included in that is all the things that people are talking about now, like taking the $600 checks up to $2,000. Support for the extra $300 a week is only through the middle of March. And if we talked about the graph that we were looking at a little while ago, that jobs are not going to recover fully until sometime next year. But we're going to need supplemental unemployment benefits a lot longer than the middle of March. Hopefully the number of people being covered continues to come down, but it's still going to be a big number. Just taking the checks, if the $600 checks cost $165 billion, which is what they were in the prior chart, adding an extra $1,400 is another $385 billion cost expense. So that's a big chunk of money for what isn't targeted for the most needy. I'm one of the people who proposes that we ought to be targeting the more needy folks and give at least an extra $300 a week for the folks who are unemployed from the end of July to the end of December. So instead of giving smaller checks, give them $300 a week times 22 weeks or $6,600 checks to the folks that lost the income, and don't give me another check because I didn't lose any income. And I know that everyone on this call is in a different situation, but a lot of us are in the situation where we didn't lose any income. So I would expect that the final number for fiscal year 2021 is going to end up somewhere close to where we were for fiscal year 2020. The way things are scored, fiscal year 2017, which was October 1st, 2016 to September 30th, 2017, was Obama's last budget year, and fiscal year 2021 will be Trump's last budget year. When we count jobs, the January 2021 number will be part of Trump's record, and the first quarter real GDP growth number will be part of Trump's record. We won't know that until sometime in the second quarter. End of April will be the first estimate of that. Change in
I can help here.
debt. Well, I did want to point out one thing here before I'll turn it over to you. If you look at the little triangles, are how much GDP changed up or down. Okay, so China is the only G20 country with growth. A lot of our friends across the aisle say that to get good growth, you can't have all these restrictions. As a practical matter, China showed that you can have the most restrictions in the world and you get good growth. If you look at deaths per million population, David talked earlier that the U.S. is at almost 1,200 deaths per million population. China is at 3. South Korea is at 23. Indonesia is at 91. So, these countries that are doing better than us on GDP growth are countries that had more restrictions rather than fewer, because they figured out that it wasn't restrictions that were causing your economy to go down. It was how much the virus was out of control. And to a certain extent, that's what I see when I look at this chart, is the countries that had the virus the most out of control: Spain, Italy, Mexico now, India now, are the countries that had the biggest hit to GDP. And then I will let you explain what else you wanted to say about this chart.
No, I think that was very good. I don't have anything else I want to add to that. I just, first time I saw this chart too, I was trying to digest what exactly it was saying. But one thing I'll add is when you look at the color coding, discretionary deficit versus non-discretionary, the idea of an automatic stabilizer is something like unemployment insurance or the food stamps, for example. These are things that if you're eligible, you just apply for them and you get them, meaning there isn't extra legislation that's needed. So when the economy gets into difficulty, these automatic stabilizer spending, it automatically goes up significantly when there's a big recession. And so that's how they split that out between the green, which is sort of like the CARES Act would be green, and then the non-discretionary deficit, the automatic stabilizers, would be like food stamps and unemployment insurance normally. The unemployment insurance that goes up because more people are taking it, not because of the CARES Act, which added additional amounts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think one thing that's not well understood is how big an impact automatic stabilizers have. And there's a thread of argument among economists that they want to make automatic stabilizers a bigger part of the economy, meaning more when the economy is doing well, they kick in more, and when the economy is doing well, they're taking away more, so that the government is automatically acting when there's a change in what's going on in the economy, and you're not dependent on politics and legislation. It's sort of a technocratic solution to the problem of, take action when it's needed, or to automatically action is taken. You don't need the government to create new legislation for it. And so someday we should cover that in more detail, but that's a really interesting concept, argument going on in the economics profession around this discretionary versus non-discretionary or automatic stabilizers. So I think, Carl, we're at break. Go ahead, sorry.
I'm not sure if this is the best time to ask this question now, but it occurs to me, and I'm not in Social Security yet, so if I misunderstand it, those of you who are can correct me, but as I understand it, your Social Security payments are calculated as a function of your last few years of income. And if that's correct, there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are going to get lifelong reduced Social Security benefits unless they've done something, which is maybe my question, as a result of a loss in income during one of their last couple of years before they retire. Is that not true?
Social Security, I believe, is based upon your highest 20 years of income. So it's unlike teacher pensions here in Illinois, which are driven more by the last year or two of income. You're looking at the highest 20 years, and so if you had a big drop in the last couple of years, your income 20 years ago will kick in and be higher.
Well, that would certainly help if you're correct there. Although if with inflation and with people normally getting raises, it seems like there would still be a hit. Maybe not as bad as I had feared, though, and that's good news.
I think when I've looked at income tends to peak in people's 50s, and as they get closer to average income, as you get closer to retirement age, actually tends to start going down, and so it may be closer to what you were doing in your 40s. We had a question in the chat. Somebody says it thinks Social Security is based on 35 years of income. Okay. But one of the questions I saw was, how am I going to tell who needs the cash? Well, my $300 a week, $6,600 checks will go to the people who were collecting, just state unemployment from the end of July to the end of December. So that period of time when we weren't giving supplemental checks funded by the federal government. So it's a fairly simple, if laborious, problem to identify those people and cut the checks for the number of weeks they were receiving state unemployment benefits.
We had another question that was around the idea of the social safety net versus automatic stabilizers. To use an example, Social Security would not be an automatic stabilizer, but it's a key part of the safety net. Same thing with Medicare. Medicare is part of the safety net, but it's not an automatic stabilizer. Automatic stabilizers tend to kick in when there's a recession. And so right away, so if you have all of a sudden a lot of people are unemployed, unemployment insurance is going to kick in. Food stamps is another one. You're going to have a lot of people out of job. They don't have the income, so they can qualify for food stamps, and they do. So the automatic stabilizers are a subset, I would say, of the social safety net is one way to think about it.
Okay.
And I think we're at a good time for a break, right?
That sounds good. A good time for a break, and then we're going to hand back off to you. So I'll stop sharing, and when we come back, you can start sharing.
All right. So let's meet again at 8:30. Take a 9-minute break here.
And in the meantime, if anybody has any questions, I'll try and field them now because I don't need a break, or I can take one when David's talking.
Okay, Carl, this is Mark.
Yeah.
To David's comment about Medicare not being an automatic stabilizer, Medicare is probably spending some more money right now on treatment, especially since the COVID is hitting seniors pretty hard and has a much higher hospitalization rate for seniors than for younger people. So in that regard, it could be seen as partially a stabilizer because you aren't pulling money out of people for medical care that they need. So it could be a reimbursement.
But in general, it's something that people are getting regardless, and
Agreed.
Certainly a lot of older people are hospitalized and dying from it. A lot of old people were hospitalized and dying before COVID. And so
the numbers are notably up.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and in some.
Oh, I'm back.
earlier this year, I think, before this most recent surge, I think the total cost of healthcare wasn't up all that much for the year to date, just because a lot of people were avoiding other care.
I also remember that. People are avoiding going to the doctor.
Are you cooking something?
I work in the agriculture sector.
No.
Last year, I believe the IRS said that 40% of the income in agriculture was due to government payments because of the attempt by Trump to buy off the tariff costs plus the basically the change in the economy. What do you expect to happen in that area now?
Well, I would guess that when President Biden comes in, he has a few other things on his plate before he's going to really start looking at tariffs and tariff levels and relaxing those. Because, a lot of those are trade negotiations. We would,
Trump
we wouldn't
backed us out of a bunch of trade.
we wouldn't necessarily come in and automatically eliminate all of our tariffs without negotiating that the other
Right.
country would eliminate theirs as well.
What Congress did was try to make up the difference by making payments to really cover some of the loss associated with the tariffs.
Actually, I think Trump did that on his own, but that's a different issue.
Well, yeah, he found some way to get it out, get the money out.
Oh yeah, he took some of the money he was getting from the tariffs and paid it to the farmers. So that U.S. consumers pay more money.
It was authorized by Congress.
The extra money to the farmers?
Yeah.
Okay, I'd have to go back and look.
Yeah, because they had to pass some legislation to get it done.
Okay.
And and they did some other supplemental things too, as far as feeding programs that I think are extended for a while that really stimulated some demand and things there. But the agriculture sector has been hurting, and it would really have been devastating without those payments in the past year.
Yeah. Well, one of the
I think the actions he did is going to disrupt the export markets for quite a while.
Yeah. One of Trump's first acts hurt the agriculture sector significantly when he walked away from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
So when agricultural producers are trying to export their products over to Asia right now, we have much higher tariffs on our agricultural products than countries that are party to whatever they call the successor to the TPP that doesn't include the U.S.
Yeah, but basically he gave an advantage to South America, Canada, and somewhat to the European Union.
Oh no, the European Union is not part of that, but like Australia has.
I think they may have gotten some separate benefits. They weren't part of the TPP, but I think because that was the U.S. pulled out, they may have gotten some other negotiations in there. But
yeah, they may have their own separate negotiations with the Asian countries.
New Zealand, Australia, Brazil, Uruguay, Canada, I think all had significant benefits from the U.S. pulling out of it.
Yeah, and my sister's in Vietnam. It has been for 4.5 years now. And so I have a decent handle on that. We're talking about China having 3 deaths per million people. Vietnam has 0.4 deaths per million people.
Yeah, my daughter was in Cambodia, and her fiance is there. They've got much less. They've got less than that.
Yeah. And Vietnam is not a small population country. It's got a population of 97 million.
Yeah.
And it took till July before they got their first death.
The last couple of parts of this are personal income, which is a subject we have not gone through in detail. There's a lot of economists trying to figure out kind of the effect of the CARES Act and on different parts of the economy, trying to understand who got what income and some interesting results from that. And then also we'll dig into student loans in some detail. We'll look at the distribution of who's got them and who's paying them and what would different alternatives for forgiveness, how they impact the different groups. So let's start with personal income. Let me walk you through what this is, and then we'll go through it. You're all pretty familiar with the idea of GDP, which is the production of the economy. And so usually we think of that as a formula of personal consumption plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports equals GDP. So it's C plus I plus G plus NX for net exports equals GDP. That's sort of the production side. There's also the income side. That's what this is. And there are some differences between the overall, the production side calculation and the income side calculation. And I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure of what the differences are. My econ textbook says it's a question of depreciation is a big part of the difference, but don't quote me on that. I still have to learn more about it. But the way that personal income is calculated, if you look at the left-hand side over here, it's wages and salaries, and that would include bonuses. Then you have employer contributions, which are things like the employer is contributing to your health insurance or contributing to your 401k. So those are benefits that employees are getting. Proprietor's income is small business income. That wouldn't be the income of a giant corporation. It would be small businesses. Rental income, and then receipts on capital. So dividends and interest typically from shares of stock owned in big businesses or their bonds or even government bonds. And so that is sort of subtotal. And just to give you first scale, remember that GDP is somewhere in that 21 trillion neighborhood. Then there are also transfers that people get. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, benefits that people are getting from the government, cash. And I believe this is not all cash. So the Social Security might be cash, but some of the Medicaid piece is Medicare and Medicaid, I think are some kind of a computed figure, but don't quote me on that part. Transfers, unemployment insurance, transfers of other kinds, including the checks that just went out. And then also take away contributions for social insurance, premiums that are paid into Medicare. There's some other things that people pay for some of these government benefits. And so you get a net number for government transfers. And then you get the subtotal, a number called personal income. We're getting closer to that 21 trillion GDP figure. Take away personal current taxes, which are your government taxes. And then you have, well, what other kind of taxes are there besides government? You have your federal and state taxes. And then you have the disposable personal income. And then you take away what people actually spent and you get savings. So it's the sort of income minus taxes is disposable personal income, less what you spend is your savings. And so this is a big other equation that's part of the economy. And again, the closest number you can see on here in this left-hand column, which is the average for March to November, is this closest to the GDP numbers is 18.5 number, or this year it's probably a little closer to 19.9. So this again is the idea of what does the income side of the ledger look like, so to speak. And the way I did the math here was New York Times did a great article. It's down there in the lower right-hand corner that goes into this. Their numbers are a little different from mine. I'm not sure why. They said they averaged the March to November periods in the 2 years and compared them. I know that these are the right numbers from the actual BEA piece. So I suspect the New York Times may have seasonally adjusted something or done something a little bit differently, but the numbers are close. Just when you are comparing against that article, just be aware that there'll be some slight differences, but these are numbers that I could tie to directly and to kind of explain this concept. And so let's talk about some interesting implications when you compare 2019 and 2020. And the big difference, the effect of the recession, but also the CARES Act. And so if you look at the right hand, this change column, and these are dollars and billions, by the way, obviously. So you got to add a lot of zeros to the end of that to get to those numbers. But the change, very small change for the most part in most of these categories of wages, proprietor's income, rental, not big differences, but although you had some sizable differences as receipt on capital. The dividends and interest did get cut, or interest rates lower might have affected the interest, but the dividends would have been cut by certain companies that did. There were several companies and quite a few companies that cut their dividends, I suspect is where that comes from. But the reason I wanted to share this chart with you is what's going on in the next section. The transfers for unemployment insurance went from 28 billion on average per month. It's a monthly, you can think of this as a monthly average. Sorry, let me step back. Annualized figure, average annualized number. So each of these columns that I was adding up or I was averaging are annualized figures. So when you average those, it's still annualized. These numbers right here, $28 billion in UI for the year 2019 for those months, annualized, 693 in 2020. And so that big difference of 665, that's the CARES Act. Same thing with the transfers. Mostly a big chunk of this was the checks that people got, the $1,200, I believe. Again, another 600 billion increase, off the charts in terms of percentage size change. And so what this does is as this comes down, you see this big increase in net government transfers. And then so the personal income is a lot higher. And then the taxes weren't much different. Then people, so you see the difference, this 1413, the 1320, 1369, all pretty similar numbers, but then people spent a lot less. Personal outlays or spending were a lot lower. And so when you add up those two numbers, you get a huge increase in savings. So people put away $2 trillion more in 2020 than they did in 2019. So strangely enough, the CARES Act was right around that number, almost $2 trillion. Now, clearly, everybody that got money through the CARES Act did not save it. What you did here is you got a lot less spending on stuff. And we covered last time, spending on services dropped a lot, and spending on goods went up, but not enough to fully offset it. So the outlays, the spending has fallen because services fell more than goods. Goods actually went up a little bit. So personal savings up $2 trillion, which is enormous. So any questions on the math here? I'm sorry, I probably confused things a little bit. These are average annualized numbers. So I took 9 months, March, November, 9 months of figures, just averaged them, and then I compared the two. This is what the New York Times did, although their numbers are slightly different. And there you go. So that's personal income. It's like GDP, but not the same. It adds up to a number that's a little bit smaller, but allows you to see kind of what's going on in the middle and these big changes driven by the CARES Act and the amount of money in that center, and that's highlighted in yellow here, and then the change in the spending. All right. And there was a question that came up about it wasn't a stimulus plan. In theory, the idea was really relief because Carl mentioned it, if you put it well, a few months ago, we don't want people running around spending money right now. That isn't what we want. We want them to hide out. We want to keep them whole while they're hidden in their homes, staying safe. And so stimulus is when you got a general slowdown in the economy. You want people out and spending on everything you can. In this case, what happened is because people cut their spending and also had more money because of the CARES Act, they actually wound up saving a great deal of it. And so to some extent, that's a good thing, but it bodes well in that the money is going to be there when the economy turns. But yeah, correct. It was not designed as a stimulus. It's a relief package. It's a different concept.
Yeah, I would say that right now, although a lot of politicians in Washington call it a stimulus, we're really way too early to be worrying about trying to stimulate the economy. We need to go ahead and get them safe, and then, and in the meantime, provide relief to the people who are really needing it.
Right.
Second half of this year, we can start thinking about general stimulus.
So a couple of questions over here on the right-hand side, and I can tell you in the New York Times article, they were wrestling with this, and I'll explain in the next couple of slides kind of some of the answers to this question. But before I go there, I thought it'd be interesting to throw it out there. Why do you think wages fell so little with such high unemployment, and why 20 million people, are getting unemployment insurance? But also, we know that we're like 10 million jobs down now, and at one point we were 22 million jobs. We lost 22 million jobs. Well, we're down about 22 million jobs at one point. Why do you think this wages and salaries didn't move? Any theories or thoughts on that?
Doesn't it?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, doesn't this suggest that the people who got hurt the most were at the bottom end of the curve?
Yep, that's you get an A on your paper. That's the big part of it. And I'll share that with you in a minute. But it's one of those counterintuitive kind of things, because when you look at that, you say, why would wages be pretty much, flat with the prior year? This down $38 billion up here. That's not a big change. It's a tiny percentage change. It's like a statistical aberration. Why is that? And you're going to see some eye-popping numbers in terms of how wages and salaries are distributed. I'll share that with you in a moment.
And maybe tying it slightly into politics, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too deeply. But this kind of phenomena might explain why certain people were inclined to vote the way they were in certain years, maybe not just with COVID, but in past years, the bottom of the curve wasn't doing very well either.
Yeah.
One of the reasons, I was going to say, one of the other reasons why the March to November, if you remember, March through July, 60 to 70% of the unemployed people were actually taking home more than they were before they lost their jobs.
Yep.
Because of an extra $600 a week.
Right. In theory, that's covered under the transfers.
Okay.
Yeah, that's in this yellow highlighted bucket here.
Okay.
Is my understanding. Right. So no, it's that's what I thought too. I was wondering if the statisticians at the government are having some trouble trying to keep those separate. Like some of that UI really showed up in wages. I found it hard to believe that it's really an income inequality issue, but I'm going to share some data on that. That's pretty amazing when you see it. But I do wonder if there's going to be some restatements of this, and we'll see. But this is where these numbers are right now, and these are right from the same group that gives us the GDP statistics. I mean, this is how it's done. This is how the math is computed. Same question for the group on the rental income. Why do you think, with so many millions behind on rent, that rental income has stayed where it is?
Well,
somebody's fire extinguisher or fire alarm.
There's a general trend towards rental income going up. I know here in Chicago, we were deconverting condo buildings back to rental buildings prior to COVID. And so that there was, rental costs of rental rent was going up substantially. And then, of course, in the last year, it's gone down about 12% in the city.
Interesting. I do have some data on the wages.
If you were locked into a lease before, at the beginning of the year, how much of the lower rent is reflected versus your older higher rent. If you had an October lease, you signed a high rental agreement last October. You may have got negotiated it down this October, but for most of the year, you're paying the higher rent.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have an answer for you on rent. I don't know at all. I didn't see any. I haven't seen any discussion of why the rental income is where it is. So something to dig into for me. I've got to figure out some of this, but it's going to be interesting watching these numbers to see if they make changes to them or if there's some better analysis of what they are, because even the New York Times wasn't entirely sure. And I follow a lot of economists on Twitter, and some of them covered this subject. It's not clear to them why these numbers look quite like this. So let's start to explore some of this.
Let's revisit in April when they agree.
Yeah. So to the
They
point of
did say
income
that the housing prices went up because during this time, because those who had money were looking for better houses if they were going to spend the time at home. Is it possible that there's a percentage of that that's being driven by that's driving rent somehow?
Yes. I mean, you know, you've got people who are decided that they want to get out of a densely populated city and get out into a more rural location where they can, and so they'll rent a property to work remotely for a period of time. And so that may be, you know, in addition to whatever their normal housing costs were, they're going ahead and doing rental that way.
Yeah, it could be.
You know, it's John McCain's I don't know how many houses I have problem.
All right. So regarding the distribution, now I'm just talking about compensation. So what I'm doing here is I'm summarizing these first two lines: wages and salaries, and the employer contribution and benefits, kind of added together, and then showing how those two are distributed. So the thing that surprised me was that the bottom 70% of families, or bottom 70% households, get 35% of the compensation, and that is pretty much what the top 10% get. That's what this chart says. So it's income deciles along the bottom. This is the top 10%, the higher income decile, and then here are all the bottom ones. So we mentioned earlier that this recession has really hit these lower income groups harder than the higher income groups. You know, if you are a professional, you can be working from home in many cases. You know, if you're in the service industry like accounting or something like that, you can work from home. And if you are a line worker in a warehouse, you've got to be you've got to be there. A lot of those jobs. That's not a really good example. If you're in leisure, you're a waiter or waitress. That's where the impact has been, and these tend to be lower wage jobs, fast food or others that have been kind of cut back. And so 70% of the workers get what the top 10% of workers get in aggregate. That was an amazing statistic to me. But that's why, as Paul suggested earlier, why the wages and benefits may have been pretty flat was this. There's just not that much impact. If you take out the bottom 30% of workers, you're only talking about 3.1 plus 2.3 plus 1.2. You know, 6% of the compensation. 6.5%. Yeah. So it's incredible how skewed this is. So this helps a little bit with trying to understand why those first two lines have almost immaterial changes because of a gigantic crisis. It hasn't hit the top end the way, let's say, and I didn't compare this to the 2009, but back then you had a lot of finance jobs that were wiped out, and so I suspect you would have seen a larger drop off in the wages and salaries and employer contributions. All right, so this is the distribution. What I did here is I took the first row of this table. This is that graph is the first row of this table. So you can see in the upper right corner here that 33% is this 33% here in the upper right bar. And I just put this here for you guys. You can play with these numbers, but what you see is when you look at that top 10% group, they have a 33% share of the compensation, but in terms of business income, 79% of it, the proprietor's income, row 2. You go down a little further to row 4. Receipts on assets, that actually is a sum of the two below it, row 5 and row 6. You can see that's skewed to the top. 55% of the income from that source goes to that top 10% group. And then on down, you get more evenly distributed things when you talk about transfers. But that capital income, household dividend income, row 6, household interest income, row 5. which add up to row 4. Very highly skewed toward the top 10%. Now, this is another way of looking at it. This was an interesting chart that kind of showed, and this gets to per household, and it's a change in household income since February, and what caused those changes. So if you look at the dotted line here along the bottom, let's start at the bottom here. This dotted line says, what would have happened if the government had not intervened, if you'd had no CARES Act? And the pre-existing programs help, but then you got a big help from the UI CARES Act, and then I guess what he's calling stimulus, as stimulus parts of the CARES Act. Then the loans to the businesses, other CARES Act, other pre-existing government benefits. And so saying that instead of losing 4,000 without government benefits, instead of being a loss of 4,000, they actually got about $5,000 positive. If I'm interpreting that right, let's see. Average household would have lost 4,000 in income without government benefits, and including government benefits, the average household has seen an increase of $5,439. So it's a $9,000 swing. So you got almost $10,000 in benefit per family from government benefits, including the CARES Act. So when people say to you, and we got to be careful with our terminology of stimulus versus relief, but when you say the government can't make a difference in ordinary lives, the stimulus is wasted, government shouldn't intervene when there's a downturn. We heard a lot of this in 2009 from Republicans, right? They were blocking the Obama stimulus. This time, you can just see it clearly, an enormous difference made with these types of interventions. And it's something to think about in the future when Democrats want to enact a stimulus to help the economy when it's in trouble. Do it in a way that you can measure clearly, because a lot of people fought saying, well, we don't know what those things, how much benefit we got specifically from the ARRA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus under Obama. You can see the studies from the CBO and others that said it made a nice difference, but this is a really nice way of seeing it in dollars and cents for selling the benefits of a government intervention. A great deal of benefit that were derived here, about $10,000 per household. Again, on average, it's distributed differently, but pretty big difference. All right, so related to this is this idea of the K-shaped recovery, that some people are doing great and some people aren't. And set some buckets there. They call it a K-shaped recovery. When you think about you've heard these different shapes in the news, the V-shape, where Trump was talking about the V-shaped recovery. We had a big drop off, and then all of a sudden we have a big V-shape coming back up. And Carl and I shared some slides with you earlier that showed that, yeah, you had a big drop off, and then you had a pretty good, there was a recovery of somewhat, and then it sort of flattened out. An example of the jobs are about 55, 56% of the jobs have come back that were lost. We're still about, of that 20 million jobs that fell, or the job level that fell 20 million, we're still 10 million down, approximately. So the K-shaped recovery is saying you've had a V-shaped recovery if you're rich or better off, and you're still in the tank if you're not. And you can see some examples of who's in the different buckets. So if you can work from home, you've got a 3.9% unemployment rate. If you have to work at your employer, it's 8.3%. If you're highly educated, if you got a 72,000 median income, you're fine. If you're less than a bachelor's degree, you got a 39,000 median income. So they show the two Americas kind of here in terms of the benefits and the impact of this crisis. And so you'll hear this term K-shaped recovery. Good to be in the upper part of that K. Not so good if you're down on the bottom. All right. Any questions on this personal income section? And this is the first time we've shared this data with the group. It's the first time I've really studied it, so I will accept responsibility for confusing things if I was explaining it. But I hope that the table was handy and that it's just, again, I'll say these were annualized figures. I just computed them averaging several months because that's what the New York Times had done with their analysis. Because what happens, you see, is the certain months are really, there's big fluctuations, like the CARES Act the unemployment insurance ran through, from like, what was it, Carl, March to July? And
March
so you got
to the
these
end
giant,
of July. I think it
yeah.
was discontinued July 26, 28, something like that.
So you see like these gigantic numbers in a couple of those months, and then they drop off. And so I've averaged, most of the year to show it. And that's, again, suggested by, that's kind of how the Times analyzed it. But that article, Why Markets Boomed in a Year of Human Misery, is a really, really good one. All right. Last subject, student loans. You've seen this chart before. We've shared it. We wanted to let people know these are all the cool things that Joe Biden has talked about doing. And there's an article at the bottom from Vox that sort of the future that Joe Biden wants, and it covers a lot of these subjects and has hyperlinks to a bunch of others. So if you want a one-stop shop for trying to understand what Biden's planning to do, that's a really good one. I suspect we're going to get a lot of new and improved ones coming up in next, I don't know how fast it's going to be because we're going to be doing a lot of impeachment stuff, but let's call it February, March. We're going to be seeing a lot more of the Biden agenda laid out. He's going to want to hit the ground running in his first 100 days. There is a lot, and this is where you get into some of that tricky parliamentary stuff that happens in the Senate, but a really good article in Vox today about what Biden can do with 50 senators passing with reconciliation, I believe. And a lot of these things he can do with 50 senators. He doesn't need a filibuster-proof majority to get a lot of these things done, but I want to digest that more, and we'll probably get into that as the specific proposals come forward. But this is quite a list of them. Most of them are very progressive. We'll talk again about some of those things that maybe aren't so progressive that Democrats have been asking for. But in general, this is the most progressive agenda I think it's fair to say that for the Democratic platform that's ever been put forward, at least let's say recently. Putting out Medicare and Social Security in the first place probably beats it. But in terms of what we've seen in the last, post-Reagan, this is as progressive a platform as we've seen in a president that's actually going to get the job. So let's talk student loans. Student loans are about $1.7 trillion as of the third quarter. I've got the real, meaning inflation adjusted and nominal numbers. This only goes back 10 years, so these numbers aren't hugely different, but I wanted to put them out there so you can see it. But they've gone, adjusted for inflation, they've gone up from $628 billion in 2006 to $1.7 trillion now. So that's a gigantic increase, and I'll explain kind of what are the components of that increase. Why did it go up? Why are people willing to incur this debt? Well, there's a couple statistics on the right-hand side, but there's still a very large college premium. A typical college grad gets about $1,400 a week versus a high school grad that gets a little bit more than half of that. So the college there are a lot of other good reasons to go to college, but if you can get there, it really brings up a lot of, you get almost twice the money. It's about a 70 to 85% premium to get a college education. So let's look at the distribution of student loans. And I use the study that goes back to the second quarter of 2019. So the data is a little over a year old, but at least it was all in one place so we can kind of analyze it. And these big distribution numbers aren't going to change significantly in a year. Just as I mentioned before, the number was 1.7 trillion. In this study, as of the second quarter of 2019, it was 1.5 trillion. So you have some statistics there along the left, but let's start with the table on the right-hand side over here. There are about 43 million borrowers, and you can see how much they owe: less than 10,000, 10 to 50, 50 to 100, or over 100, and what percent of the borrowers that is. So the 14.2 million is 33% of the borrowers have a balance less than 10,000. And then from 10,000 to 50,000, it's 20 million borrowers, about 47%. So when you hear the proposals, you'll sometimes see eliminating, forgiving the loans, forgiving the debt below 10,000. That would be about a third of the borrowers. Forgiving the loans below 50,000 would get you to almost 80%. The 33 plus 47 would get you to 80% of the borrowers would be covered. Now, keep in mind, we're going to talk about two kinds of statistics: borrowers and then also the balances that the borrowers have. And certain borrowers have a lot more, obviously, than others, and I'll share some of those statistics with you. But here's the distribution by sort of size of the balance that people have. We'll talk in a little bit about how much is how many dollars are in this over 100,000 bucket in a little bit. And so some statistics here. Average balance has been growing about 5% a year versus tuition. It's almost twice as fast as growth in the loans as there are in the tuition. Number of borrowers went from 19 million to 43. Average balance went up from 13 to 33. And I don't think these were adjusted for inflation. I think these are real, but I'm sorry, are nominal numbers, but I'm not sure. Repayment on the loans has been slow, high delinquency and default rates. And also people that are 10 years out of school have repaid less than 40% of their outstanding balances. 2005 graduates had repaid less than 40% of their balances. So this debt tends to be persistent. It's not something that people can just get rid of, or they choose not to get rid of it and do other things if they can. But it's still, it's out there and it's holding up. People would be spending the money on other things if they didn't have this debt on their shoulders. There is a correlation between high student debt balances and lower home ownership rates. And when people own homes, they tend to buy a whole lot of stuff. And about 90% of the loans are federal, 10% are private. So when the government is planning to do things, and there are certain things that they can do. I think Biden, for example, could forgive the federal loans, but I highly doubt he can forgive private loans. Good news is most of them are federal, so he can do that. So another distribution chart. This was as of October 9th, 2020. So now we're getting probably the data from the second quarter of 2020, more recent information. But you've got more of a distribution here. So share of the outstanding debt. This dark blue area here is the highest quintile of income earners. So this is by income earner quintile. So 26% of the outstanding debt is held by those in the highest 20% of income, 32% in the fourth quartile. So this is almost 70% of the debt is held by people that are in the top 40%. Quintile is 20% of the population. So the top two quintiles. And then down at the bottom, it isn't that much. There isn't that much that's in the lowest quintile or in the second quintile of income. Those people aren't the ones that tend to have student loans. They tend to be in the richer people because they go to college, they get paid more, and they're the ones that have the loans. That's also, though, why if you forgive student loans, you tend to be helping people that are in the upper income brackets. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just simply means it's not as progressive as you might think. So there are some distribution statistics over here. Households in the upper half of the distribution have a disproportionate share of the debt, and that's what I was just showing here. I'm not going to go into the share of monthly debt payments. That was confusing me when I was reading it. Highest income, 40%, have about 60% of the debt. So that's right here. This is about 60% are these darker blue areas. Lowest 40% of households hold under 20% of the debt. That's right here. First and second quintiles are only 20% of the debt. Fed data shows households with graduate degrees owed 50% of the outstanding education debt. That's what I was trying to say here of, even though there may only be 7% of the borrowers that have over 100,000, there is a lot of money in that over 100,000 bucket because people go to graduate school. Think of a doctor that's going to have $200,000 or $300,000 worth of loans maybe when they come out. Although they have an enormous income, you would hope, they still have an enormous load of debt. Other people too. If you go through and get your master's degree from a private school, you're going to have 100 or 200,000 in debt on top of your undergraduate degree. So it's very concentrated. So they said here that households with graduate degrees owed 50% of the outstanding education debt, but only 14% of adults have graduate degrees. So, and here's a good one, 3% of adults with professional and doctorate degrees hold 20% of the education debt. So another thing Biden can think about when he forgives student loans is, do I forgive loans only for undergraduate, or do I forgive loans for graduate? Do I make a special with what doctors and nurses are going through? Should I forgive loans that doctors and nurses take out? Maybe we're going to, after we killed off a couple thousand so far, I think we're looking at more people in healthcare that are dying because of coronavirus. Do we need to incentivize them more? We'll see. I've heard that there are actually a lot more people going in there. But so as you're wrestling with this idea, understand, I think this is one of my favorite statistics here, is that the top 40% of income earners have got almost 70%, 60% of the loan. The second bullet right here. Oops, sorry. The second bullet, I think, is a key one to remember. And then just another group that really gets hurt is people that have student loan debt, but they didn't even get a college degree, or they only have an associate's degree, because they got the debt, but they didn't get necessarily the benefits of getting the degree that they should. This is another one. Interestingly, the number of loans, so the people, don't think about balances for a minute, but just the number of people that have loans are pretty evenly distributed across the different income quartiles, interestingly. So, and it says the number of student loan borrowers are roughly constant across neighborhood income grouping. So, sorry, this has to do with where they're living. So borrowers, whether it's a fourth quartile or third quartile, second quartile, first quartile zip code, and they tend to be spread out among those zip codes pretty evenly. And this one gets at the idea of higher income. The people that have the larger balances do tend to concentrate in higher income areas. So number of borrowers pretty evenly spread out among the different income quartiles, because people get loans that are in all levels of the income distribution. But the loan balances are more concentrated in those higher income buckets. Okay. So here's our debate, and I will open it up to the floor here. There's some statistics for you to chew on here. This article was great from Catherine Rampel, made me really think about this and what we're trying to do as progressives. She said, and Catherine Rampel is very liberal, by the way. She is a progressive type. And her title of the article is very provocative. New Year's goal for progressives: stop advocating bailouts for rich people. And she makes the case. And I've taken some of the statistics that she had, but also added some from what we've just gone through to talk about it a little bit, give you some background. But, let's take them in order. For student loans, if you were to forgive $50,000 per person, we just talked about the distribution. About 80% of the borrowers have loans below $50K. The people are evenly distributed across the income groups, but the larger dollar balances are concentrated in higher income groups. Going back to that statistic right here, the highest 40% of households owe 60% of the education debt. And here's a statistic from a study that said a $50,000 forgiveness would average $700 for people in the bottom income decile and $5,000 for the top decile. That's not what we usually advocate with progressive policy. And that's because those bottom deciles just don't have the student loan debt. They're not college educated people. And so they're not going to have the kind of income that those upper bracket people have. One of the challenges here, and I don't have statistics on that, is the net worth concept, that some of these people that may have high income, if they've got a lot of student loans, may not have much net worth. Your first year out of medical school, if you somehow get the $200,000 job, but you've got $200,000 in student loan debt, it's going to take you years to dig out of that before you have a positive net worth. So what's the right way to chew on it? So let's pause there and let's talk student loans before we go to the other two areas. What do you guys think about
I have a couple of thoughts on it, David. Number one, your comment about people with high debt going to high value zip codes. That sounds to me like rational decision making. I mean, I know there's arguments about economics and rational decision making from the behavioral guys, but I mean, you're going to go where you can pay it off. That's my first thought. And the other thought that I've said, I put into the chat, is that, okay, so we have a situation where people in the lower income buckets haven't appeared to acquire debt, probably by not attending school, because they couldn't afford it. And I know of people like that. We've helped some of them. Personal friends, we've helped out a little bit to keep them even in junior college. And I think that we can't fix history. We have this situation now, but we can fix it going forward by making college affordable and achievable over income spectrum. And we don't have to keep making the same mistakes and digging a deeper hole. And, if we were progressive, we would say, okay, if you're below a certain income level, we'll help you this much with junior college. Maybe we'll make it free. Maybe we'll pay you to go to school, because at a national level, if we could do that over the long term, we know there's benefit. We know it's a winner. It's a legitimate investment if it's done well, to send people to trade or college, whatever. We know it's a valid, remunerative investment to do it. So I think I don't have any problem paying off this debt, most of it, even the grad school debt. Even though I was able to go to grad school 3 times and get somebody else to pay for it.
Good for you. Yeah, my old company paid for half of my MBA. Sears paid for half of my MBA.
Yeah, Motorola paid for mine and a couple of other degrees too.
Good.
So but I hope I got my point across. I need to stop.
So one way to handle
Anyone
that
else? What else?
is you say you're going to give $50,000. It's either paying off debt or it's a grant for education.
529. Merry Christmas.
Yeah. You want a level playing field? There's one way to level it.
Yeah, that passes my test, at least at first glance.
One of the challenges with this and trying to get it passed, and this is where the idea is that I like the $50,000 grant idea, is that everybody gets a benefit, because what happens is you say if you say we're going to forgive debt we're going to give a benefit only to certain people, then a lot of other people say, well, what do I get? Why don't I get something? And so that's a great part of that grant idea. Or if you give something to everyone, let's say Biden wants to forgive $10,000 in student loans, why doesn't he give a grant of $10,000 to everybody? So that's one of those, a check for $10,000 to everyone. And then maybe in the case of the student loan people, he forces them. In other words, he pays off their student loans. He doesn't give them $10,000 to spend on other stuff. He just retires 10,000 student loans for all those people. Everybody else that doesn't have student loans gets a check for $10,000 for their family. Every family gets a $10,000 check, and that's that. In other words, that's part of the sales process of trying to get something meaningful and helpful done. Is you just have to get it. You can't just help some people. You got to help everybody.
A straightforward answer to the question of what do I get is you don't get screwed by a broken system.
So we've talked a lot about how to subsidize, or how to make how to get money to pay for the very expensive college education. Are there any things we can do to make the education cost less, to improve its value, if you will?
Plenty.
Okay.
Certainly. I mean, we could subsidize. If you look at the education funding over the last, say, 20 years. The universities used to get heavy subsidies from the state, especially the land grant colleges, of which, University of California, when I got my degree there in 2007, because I was online, I paid $700 to $900 for a graduate course because it was in-state tuition because it was online. Today, that course is $3,000 to $5,000 each. If we were to go back in that direction, that would give more people access. But that was because the state of California was pouring money into the University of California system. Today, they can't do that. Now, Newsom's going to try to go back to that a little bit, but we need to look at what it costs to run a college and what it costs to go.
You did say something in your reply, though, that might be a pretty good idea. The phrase online. There's been a lot of changes in the last decade, including what we're doing here today. So is any of this technology usable to make it cost less to educate a person, maybe by educating more at the same time, maybe by some other means? Or even non-technological solutions. Again, I'm not just talking about coming up with more money for the system, which clearly we've spent a lot of time discussing, but can we do things to get more education out of the money that we do spend?
We haven't seen in the last year that education is really more effective online. We've just seen that it's possible. It's just a different kind of work. If there is research to establish we can do more effective education online, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I don't know whether the education has dropped off over the last year because more of it's online. One of the things that I want to go back to on Catherine Rample's article, I need to have a better understanding of what the current programs are for people to get subsidized payoffs of their student loans, especially the pre-Betsy DeVos programs that were in place during the Obama administration, where people could work 20 years and pay a certain percentage of their income towards their student loans. At the end of that 20 years, the rest of their student loan would be forgiven. Or they could work in government jobs.
I will speak to that. My understanding is that the income-based repayment programs, the Department of Education works very hard to kick people out of them. There are a vast number of stories of people who have done, quote unquote, everything they should have, get to the end of their 10 years and find out that something got fucked up along the way. One of their payments didn't get recorded properly, and so suddenly, for whatever reason, the government is saying the entire 10-year record is useless.
Was this true prior to Trump?
Yes.
Okay, because I saw a big shift in that with Betsy DeVos.
Could be.
But just because the system isn't broken doesn't mean we shouldn't go in and fix it.
Right.
Yeah.
But
what Catherine Rample was saying is that most of the people who have lower loan balances were benefiting from the existing system and not, and weren't ending up in a world of hurt. And that's why you get that average of $700 for $50,000 of forgiveness, because they were already getting a lot of their loans forgiven.
There are a couple of other things that need to be discussed here in terms of changing the system. Back in 2013 or so, Elizabeth Warren published an article where she advocated setting the interest rate on student loans to the federal funds rate, because there is no reason why the government should be charging 8% interest on a student loan and 0.5% interest on a bank loan.
Good idea.
But lenders
Well,
tend to take into account risk.
Wait a minute. Yeah, the issue of loan rate is tied to risk and defaults. So would defaults be lower if we were having a lower interest rate and payback was more profitable? I don't know.
I'm certain it would be.
That
The
study
question
should
is how
definitely
much.
be done.
Yeah, I was really happy when I graduated college and I had that low 8% interest rate.
Yeah, I was paying 7. When you graduated from
In
college,
1982,
Carl. When you graduated from
the prime
college,
rate was over 20%.
Carl, when you graduated from college, I was paying 7 1/4 on a mortgage.
Oh, when I was graduating college, you could have gotten a mortgage for about 16%. The prime rate was over 20.
Needless to say, I paid that bastard off early.
Likewise.
The other thing is I have seen some documentation that as much as 10%-ish of the rise in cost of education is due to bloat in administrative staff. And so one of the things that you could do is simply institute a hard ratio of administration to faculty or administration to faculty salaries.
I don't know if you can do the Medicare thing. I mean, Medicare runs on 3%, and private insurance runs on 30. I don't know if you can do that same mandate on education, but I know it could be less.
Right?
Yeah, do we want to get social workers out of high schools because they aren't teachers? Do we want to
Well,
get
we didn't
nurses
say
out
that.
of the schools? Well,
We didn't say that.
If you're streamlining and focusing on just the number of people you can have who aren't in a direct education line, I think you've got those kinds of people who are in the equation.
Kind of depends on the type of university you're talking about too. If you're at a major research institution, there are different expenses associated with it than there are the one that's more focused on strictly classroom teaching. And
For undergraduate, you don't need maybe. I mean, I had a world-renowned astrophysicist for my freshman physics course. Maybe you don't need that. But on the other hand, you want them around because you want your TAs to be worthwhile to have at the front of the classroom too.
Yeah.
So I don't know enough about education to slice that baby.
Part of it goes back to what the state investment is in the educational system too, because as was mentioned before, in the past they covered a much larger portion of the overhead of the campus than what they do now. And so consequently, if you've got a research institution, there's a large portion of overhead for grants that go into maintenance on the facility that benefits not just the researcher, but the students that are there as well, both graduate and undergraduate. So that's a complex situation.
But yeah, certainly on state schools, and I went to Purdue, the amount of money that was provided by the states to subsidize those state schools was a lot higher. Was that 40 years ago? I mean, there's been a lot of inflation since then, but I think when I graduated Purdue in '82, tuition and fees were like $1,600 a semester.
Yeah.
No, it sounds like a good topic for us to dig into is kind of why are higher education costs going up the way they are. We every now and then will cover kind of why we think the healthcare costs are going up, but that would be a good topic. One study I remember seeing there also was the fact that loans are more readily available has caused colleges to raise their prices. Think of it as more easily available loans means there's more demand, where people want to go to college, can go to college, and so the colleges jack up their prices. They're not able to sort of, you think of a classic economics, demand and supply curve, suddenly there's more demand, but the supply doesn't expand and the price goes up. I'm curious why the supply wouldn't be able to keep up. So I've never fully understood those studies, but I've heard that as much as 20 or 30% of the increase in cost of college over the last couple of decades have been because of more loans available. But I'd like to revisit those before I bring it to this group. We are about 9:30. I don't want to go.
Beer.
I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I would read this Catherine Rampel article and bookmark it somewhere. It's really thought-provoking. And I was reading it. I wanted to challenge like every sentence, but then as I got to the end of the sentence, I'm like, okay, she's making a good point here. So, you know, if the Democrats are going to make the argument that it's progressive, then we have to be really sharp in how we do it. We got to think about which groups we give benefits to, or if we give benefits to all people to help sell it. There's, I'm sure, a lot of interesting discussion going on, like we just had in the Biden camp about how to do this in a way that's going to work. And we didn't get into the legality of this, but there's a legal view that he may be able to do it with a executive order that could be challenged in court. It can be challenged in court regardless, but also even if you pass legislation through Congress, it could also be challenged in court. But there may be a benefit to doing it with legislation if he can get the votes. So there's going to be some interesting things coming on that one. I'll leave the other two topics for another time. It's easy enough to understand when you read the Rampel article. So any last questions? Well, let me mention this. There's always a few articles and links we have here and some tweets. We didn't really get into these in this session, but if you need a tweet, meaning by tweet, I mean, if you go to that link that's here, you'll see a bunch of slides, kind of like excerpts from our presentation on that subject. So if you want to learn about income inequality, go to that link and you'll see 10 charts on income inequality. Same with wealth, same thing with the economy doing better under Democrats. So if you get into fights with people or just want to learn about these subjects, just go there. You always have it. And then I created a Wikipedia article on the economic performance under Democrats and Republicans. So we had a specific presentation we did on that last month. That stuff, most of that is out there in that Wikipedia article in text. I didn't have space because it's not a very long article. I didn't have space to put all the graphics in there, but you can at least get the facts and the links there. So some things you can take a look at if you get time.